Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, August 18th, 2024. Today, we are pleased to offer you a discussion about U.S. military approaches to what seems to be a very timely situation, a possible conflict in the Middle East, and in particular, a possible missile exchange between Iran and Israel. So joining us today is our distinguished panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer, our 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential candidate, as well as our Director of Citizen and Community Science, Daniel Tweed, and also our Foreign Ambassador in Spain and Technology Advisor, Dr. Jose Cordero. And our special guest today is also a longtime member of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, but he has special expertise in the subjects under discussion, Allen Crowley. Allen grew up in a castle listening to lions roar at dusk and playing in the wilderness near the Fort Worth Zoo. He enlisted in the Texas National Guard in high school and earned a commission as a second lieutenant while attending Texas Christian University, home of the Horned Frogs. In the military, he served as an infantry officer, working his way through the ranks from lieutenant to major, as a platoon leader, company executive officer, company commander, and staff officer. The majority of that training was designed to deter and defeat Soviet military aggression. Mobilizing for Operation Desert Storm drastically changed that focus. Deployed to Iraq as a military officer, seconded to the U.S. Department of State, Allen Crowley supported a wide range of nation-building efforts. His subsequent assignment was with U.S. Central Command, U.S. CENTCOM, in the Coalition Coordination Center, or CCC, where he worked with liaisons from over 20 countries, coordinating the military actions of 4 coalitions in which the United States was a member. His last tour was in Europe as a liaison officer between the U.S. Army Europe and the U.S. European Command, or US-EUCOM. In U.S. Army Europe, he worked in the Combined Operations and Intelligence Center, COIC, and worked in the EUCOM Joint Operations Center, or JOC. One of his many responsibilities involved simulated fighting of the Iran-Israel missile war and planning for subsequent military operations on the ground following that battle. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in January of 2012 after a 32-year career. So we're extremely pleased to have you here, Allen, and discussing this quite important set of topics that you have direct experience in. So tell us more. How did you get involved in this field of endeavor, and what did you learn during your time in the military about how the U.S. military would approach a conflict of this sort? I think we need to unmute.
Thank you. All right. You handled that for me. Appreciate that. Yes, I learned a lot in the U.S. military. It's often said that when people enlist, the first thing they learn is not to volunteer. But it was just the opposite for me. I learned to volunteer because I spent every day for the first part of my basic training with the same 60 people day in, day out, and not really an introvert, but much less of an extrovert than I thought. It was great to get on a detail and go do something else that not everybody was doing. So yeah, that was one of my first lessons, is that one, don't believe everything they tell you, like don't volunteer. And two, volunteering has turned out to be excellent help for me. I met a lot of interesting people that actually later on helped my career. So that was a good experience. So yeah, I want to also address a little bit about my first experiences in basic training, because while I was there in 1981, there was what was called Operation Opera, which was an Israeli airstrike on the Iraqi nuclear program, and they destroyed a nuclear reactor. It's a French-built nuclear reactor. I think Gennadi's already posted the link. But anyway, the drill sergeants were quite glad to trot out the newspaper and say, you guys thought you were just signing up, to get free college or whatever, but there's more to it than that. And sure enough, my last assignment, what I did was practice fighting the 34-minute war between Israel and Iran, which is basically an exchange of missiles. Although now we've seen that as April 2024, that's an exchange of missiles that are launched missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. So, but it's still no troops on the ground, so to speak. Very interesting sort of method of warfare. I was enlisted for a while, and I learned a lot there too. Like some of my enlisted buddies were like, "Oh, I ain't packing all this stuff," And I said, I came to the conclusion that when do you think the Army is going to give you more stuff than you need rather than just the bare minimum? and I always packed all my gear and took it with me, which was didn't really prove to be helpful until later when I was in Iraq, and just about everything I had on my back came in handy. So yeah, I became a platoon leader in the infantry and mechanized infantry unit. We practiced armored warfare designed to stop the Soviets in the Fulda Gap there between the mountains, basically the Polish-Ukrainian border. And that all went out of vogue very, very rapidly once we kind of tested out our new toys in Desert Storm and in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and then later with Operation Iraqi Freedom. We realized tanks weren't real good for working in dense cities, that we were fighting an enemy that did not mind changing into civilian clothes or even never putting on a uniform. They were making improvised explosive devices, is what we call them. French call them roadside bombs after their experiences in Algeria. But these were detonated with a garage door opener. So it was very interesting sort of off-the-shelf technologies that people could use to make incredibly devastating weapons. And we just thought, what? We just don't need this big, the huge military industrial machinery that we have cranking ahead with our, unstoppable juggernaut, I would suggest, of military power, like we went into Iraq with in 2003. And the other thing that really sort of tickled me, and we use language really well in this organization, the USDP, and I always got a kick out of it. They would say, "Oh, things are different now. It's all about asymmetrical warfare. They're going to use this low-tech stuff against us." And I thought it's always been about asymmetrical warfare. The difference is that we've had a gigantic asymmetrical overmatch of bringing tanks and artillery to a gunfight, right? That's asymmetrical also. And what they've done is just figured out that there are some advantages to being a small target on that battlefield. And so with all that in mind, I really thought that my lessons that I learned fighting the Soviet Union would, not fighting the Soviet Union, but preparing to fight the Soviet Union, would be worthless for my son, who's now enlisted in the Marine Corps. And yet, all he does is study war, Second World War, and the battles in Ukraine versus Russia now. And it's very much come back into vogue, this idea of shipping tons of material and equipment and material and men, as they say, including women these days, into across the world to fight huge armored conflicts, and supported by missiles that we can launch from the U.S. and hit a target, smaller than a football field, more like the size of an end zone. So it's really been an amazing journey through that for 30 years to go from, here's a rifle, you point down range, to we need to look at the entire planet. After I did my tour in Iraq, first tour, I was assigned to U.S. Central Command in Tampa, Florida. And I was there one day, and I was talking to a major on the phone who was in country, and I was like, look, that's not something that I can support. I will send your request on up, but it's not the first request like that I've seen, and it's going to be shot down. I mean, I can tell you now the answer is no. Start thinking of another solution, and I'll call you in a week when I've got the official no. But it's just not good. It's just not going to play out. And I hung up the phone, and I thought, damn it, I'm now the fat lieutenant colonel that I bitched about when I was a major in Iraq, asking these kind of questions. So forgive my French. I'm slipping back into my military language. And that was sort of an eye-opener for me, because there's a huge balancing act for national security. And it involves like our own the U.S. transportation system, our merchant marine force for deploying equipment around the world. The Navy is not the Army and Marine Corps' yacht cruise ship to get them to battle. They are there to fight on the ocean and win. We have a huge system in place through civilian contracting, merchant marines, and various other sources to move material and people around the planet. And all of that is just civilian infrastructure. Our U.S. port systems, even our U.S. border control is designed to support our military system in some form or another. So recognizing, let me preface this. So when I worked at U.S. Central Command with the CCC, I started to realize just how much the U.S. military was changing. And it wasn't just that now I was doing joint operations instead of, singular Army operations. Now I want to address that in just a moment. But literally, recommendations that I drafted that were approved by my boss, sent to the commander of U.S. Central Command, sent to the Joint Chiefs, were sent to Congress and were approved, which literally changed our national defense policy. And it was just sort of strange. I mean, there were military officers like, we're not supposed to be writing defense policy, and what we realized is we're not. We're saying this is how we want to get this done, and Congress is saying, okay, stamping it, giving us a check to make it happen. And it was brand new policy at that point. So it was interesting to see that sort of expediency on the part of Congress, which is good, but also that how broad a line of demarcation had been drawn between the politicians and the soldiers. We thought politicians were handling the policy stuff, and that was not necessarily the case. They were just, policy was whatever we said we wanted at some point, up to a point. So, and that brings me back to the way the U.S. fights wars. And most people think, oh, the Army fights on the land, and the Air Force fights in the air, and the Navy fights on the sea, and all of that is correct. But that technically is not the way we fight wars. Wait, maybe I said that wrong. Anyway, officially, the way we fight wars is through combatant commanders. And there are only a handful of those, just like there are 3 or 4 chiefs of staff, joint chiefs in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's the chairman and 3 service branch heads. They deal directly, they interface with the Department of Defense and National Security and our legislative making apparatus on one hand, and on the other hand, they deal with the 3 services and the combatant commanders. U.S. UCOM is a combatant command. U.S. Central Command is a combatant command. There's a Southcom, and there's a Northcom, which is North and South America. And there is now an AFRICOM. For a brief while, there was a Spacecom. But now there's an entire different organization for that. So that all happened after I left in 2012. But it's a matrixed organization. And what a lot of folks, when I got to European Command, didn't really realize was that U.S. Army Europe does not go and fight wars. Their job is to supply trained, ready, and equipped soldiers to U.S. UCOM. And the U.S. European commander will actually do the war fighting. Same with the Air Force. 8th Air Force is right there in Landstuhl, Germany, and their job is not to fight in the air, so to speak, until they're directed to by U.S. UCOM. So it's an interesting kind of matrixed arrangement. They provide, trained and ready airmen, pilots, and likewise the Navy and Marines. So that feature is sort of unique among the world, among the nations of the world. Not only do we divest our military and civilian decision making, we don't allow for our U.S. military forces to operate in the United States. We have other organizations for that, for crimes. And we don't allow our services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, to go and conduct operations on their own either, only in the service of a joint command under direct control of the Joint Chiefs and up to the President. So all that said, when it comes to fighting literally what we called the 34-minute war with Israel and Iran, there is a huge amount of moving parts and complexity in that stuff. So if I misspeak, if there's any people with Air Force or Navy experience and I misspeak about the Link 16, which is an Air Force program, or the Aegis missile ship program, missile cruiser program, I got my information from one of you, from an Air Force or Navy person. But those elements are each a vast and complex system. So I'll start with the Army systems because I know those the best. In Israel, we maintain a large amount of ground surveillance radar. And what ground surveillance radar is really good for, and I want to clarify some terms here, they're good for rocket and short-range missile attacks. And there's a difference between a rocket and a missile, and it's basically the guidance system. So think of a bottle rocket. That's a rocket. You light it, you can point it kind of where you want it to go, but good luck, right? And the idea is you can get a whole lot of bottle rockets go in that direction for cheaper than you can get a single guided missile go in that direction, toward the enemy. But what the ground surveillance radar does is it picks up those things that are flying through the low atmosphere within 400 feet of the ground, a little more, and then can shoot them down quite literally with either phalanx machine gun or another type of missile system. So that's kind of the base and last line of defense for Israel is our radar detection systems and the surface-to-air missiles that we've provided them that are ground-based and Army-based. Now, all of those need to talk to our Air Force, Navy, and National Security Agency assets so that they're coordinated. Let me think for a moment. The other ground sounds kind of magical, but we have ground radar systems that defeat incoming artillery also. So most artillery, people that are nations that are putting enough resources into building artillery are typically putting enough resources into their rounds so that their rounds explode slightly above the target and scatter more shrapnel that way instead of actually hitting the target, because they might land in a bog or whatever. So in order to do that, on the end of those artillery rounds is a radar that picks up how close it is to the planet as it's coming down, right? And when it gets to a certain height, it explodes. So we have a counter radar system that sends a radar beam up that gives an artillery round the illusion that the ground is actually much, much higher than it really is. And so it detonates early, and that shrapnel is scattered so far and wide that it's just falling by the time it gets to the ground without any explosive force. Those tend to be point defenses, and they're great on top of a headquarters or a presidential building or governmental complex. So those are critical. But again, last line of defense. The next line of defense is what they call THAAD, or theater air anti-air defense, and those are the Aegis missiles fired from Aegis missile cruisers permanently stationed in the Gulf, in the Mediterranean there. It's kind of like, I'm from Texas, I think of it like the Gulf of Mexico. But they're stationed in the Mediterranean, and they're within easy missile shot of any missiles that would come from Iran. And I say permanently stationed, that doesn't mean it's the same ship and the same crew there forever, but they cycle through. There's at least 3 on station at all time. Presently, we're sending a carrier group and submarine force, probably nuclear, into that region also. So they're probably there by now. I think they left last month. So the Navy has a critical role in this also. Now, their missiles are also deconflicted. So the Air Force, and back in April, I think we saw that the Jordanian Air Force shot down several, matter of fact, I think all that they engaged of drones and cruise missiles. So they shot down a large portion of the 350 different objects that were sent toward Israel. And Air Forces can do that. Our Air Force is trained to do that. The other role that our Air Force has that other Air Forces typically don't is they have an anti-space capability, which is basically they just fly straight up and fire a missile straight up to knock out satellites, which if another country is using a satellite for targeting, that'll shut that down real fast if you blow up their satellites. So the Air Force coordinates its own military satellites, and the Army, Navy, and Air Force, it's responsible for all the satellites, except those that are under the auspices of the National Security Agency. And so the National Security Agency has a global blanket that's coordinated through North American Air Defense Command. You've probably heard of NORAD under Cheyenne Mountain, prominently featured in the Terminator 2, the sequel or whatever. That coordinates launches globally. And to illustrate that point, when I was at U.S. Central Command and we had troops on the ground, we were fighting a war in Iraq. Whenever there was a missile launch, and this is kind of where I learned it real fast, they notify every nation in the world, we're about to launch a missile. And this includes SpaceX and other Blue Origins if they can ever get off the ground, and our other private space companies. If there's a launch into space and the U.S. government is aware of it, then they report it globally. And other countries have signed on to this too, including Iran. So when I was at U.S. European Command in 2009, Iran decided they wanted to test their missiles. They said, we're going to launch our missiles. This is a test, and they're going to go southeast into the Persian land in the Persian Gulf. Sure enough, they move. It takes them a week to get their missiles fired up, to fuel them, to prep the pad, to get their people ready, to arm the warheads, to do that. So at least they took a week to do that, and then they launched. And we were very specific about tracking which way are those missiles going, right? Just because they said they're going to go southeast doesn't mean they're going to go southeast. But we track them, and sure enough, those went southeast, and they landed in the water in the Persian Gulf. So, and those are all like legitimate, approved by treaty types of weapons testing procedures. If there's ever a launch that happens that is not declared, then, the klaxons start ringing, and NORAD, North American Air Defense Command, contacts the combatant commander responsible for that region of the world where the launch is, and all sorts of other things start to happen after that. And when I was at Central Command, all we did was sort of, I thought it was an interesting difference, is because we were fighting the war there, and we knew we weren't going to shoot any missiles at the enemy. If there was an alert that there was going to be a launch, then we all listened, and then when we didn't hear the klaxons, we all went back to work. It was kind of, it's kind of an interesting situation. But at U.S. European Command, because they are responsible for Israel, I'll address that on too. Whenever there was a launch, they were specifically listening for, is it like Iran launching on Israel? And they would spin up very rapidly, and then spin back down. But it was much more tension in a missile launch at U.S. European Command. Much more procedural. People were woken up if it happened at night, etc. And the other portion that was interesting about U.S. European Command is it also tracked booster landings, which tend to land in the ocean. And so they would coordinate with basically European nations about any sea traffic that they had out there to make sure that we didn't drop a booster rocket onto somebody out in the Atlantic. So they took it a little bit more seriously with the missiles. You might be wondering at this point, why in the world is U.S. European Command responsible for Israel? And I think that's an important point. U.S. Central Command contains within it, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, etc., the UAE, Oman. So all of these basically Muslim countries that do not like Israel, or at the time certainly did not. I know there's been a real rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel the last few years, but since COVID, God, go figure. Medical attention is important. But they didn't want to be in the same club with Israel, and so U.S. European Command is where most of the signatories for the Balfour Declaration agreements that created Israel as a nation, modern nation, are in Europe, and so it just seems sort of natural fit to put Israel under U.S. European Command. Again, odd. Oh, excuse me, just a moment. Oh, okay, here we go. So anyway, it's kind of an odd deal, and it was always, it was one of the plum TDY, temporary duty assignments, to get to go to Israel and look at, here's where we'd put the radars if we needed to, if things get, it's like, okay, we've seen it, now let's go to Tel Aviv, and have a beer, and then come back to Germany or whatever. So that was usually a pretty good trip. I was too low on the totem pole to get that. I got sent to Kosovo instead, but which was an interesting trip. They have a giant statue of Bill Clinton there. So U.S. European Command would do this, and the way that like I said, I worked in the Combined Ops and Intel Center there in U.S. Army Europe, and as a member of the COIC, we called it, I would spend my time in the Joint Ops Center of U.S. European Command, so that I could keep U.S. Army Europe appraised of everything that their higher command, EUCOM, was doing. And the way they operated their ops center was they had a 4-day shift, 12 on, 12 off for 4 days, and then off for 4 days, and then 12 on, 12 off for 4 days. However, it would be, for example, day shift for 4 days, off for 4 days, night shift for 4 days, off for 4 days, which I asked one of the guys that I had worked with prior to that, I said, how do you like that? He goes, I love the 4 days off. Which was all he said there. But so you have to have 3 shifts to do that kind of a cycle, 12 on, 12 off, 4 days at a time. So me as a liaison, I wasn't like a 9-to-5 job, but I was there every day as a liaison. And I slept every night. So I got to sit through nearly every missile drill that they did, because they would do one for each shift every quarter. So I did 3 every quarter. And that was they would simulate. It was kind of random. I'm not sure exactly how they determined when they pulled the rabbit out of the hat and said, oh, hey, missile alert time. But I'm pretty sure they didn't do it if there was some other real operation going on, or if the boss was out of town or whatever. But they still, it seemed fairly random to me. And they would get out the classic 3-ring binder. I mean, this looked, if you've seen the Houston Launch Center, or the Houston Space Mission Tracking Center, looked very much like that. A little bit, wasn't as steep, but it was still 6 rows deep, curved like a stadium seating or theater seating, with big movie screen at the front, podium on each side in case there was going to be somebody presenting facts and figures, and then rows of people in the seats with the commander, not really a commander, but the leader, lead staff officer in the jock would be like right in the middle, 4 rows back, and get a phone call. Okay, missile. Iran is launching, and in Israel, this is an unnotified launch. So they start pulling out the 3-ring binders, and it's quite a. It really did remind me a lot of Dr. Strangelove. Kind of had that same vibe, like get out the big book. They'd open it up. Start going through the procedures. They call it out, and the first thing that happened was somebody was delegated to call DC, and they would get it on the phone. They had a hotline there to the White House Situation Room, and it was sort of funny. On one occasion, they had that line on speaker because there was something that was moving around, and I said, "Okay, we need to speak to the president," and and the guy on the other end says, this, he goes, "You're conducting a drill. You're not going to get the president." He says, "You got me." He says, "Wait 3 minutes, or whatever," which is about how long it would take us to get the president, "and then I'll give you an answer." And man, just that idea that, okay, we're just waiting for 3 minutes while this guy goes down the hall, or, intercoms down the hall to get the president. And missiles are flying through the air at hundreds of miles an hour toward their target. And we're just waiting to fight this war, for 3 minutes. We're like on hold for 3 minutes. And he comes back and he says, the president says, engage or whatever. And the captain that was there in Turkey goes, "Well, I need the actual," because you're not supposed to take some staffer's word for it, right? It's like, "I need the actual." And he goes, you could hear like the guy wanted to get on with his day. He's like, "Oh, okay, this is the president speaking." The same guy says, "This is the president speaking. Engage." And so we're like, "Okay, all right, oh yeah, okay." He says, "Do you still need me on the line?" And we're like, No, we got to, the war gets fought now. And so, missiles have been in the air for like 10, 12, 15 minutes at that point of a 20-minute flight. And then, so the orders immediately go out to the Aegis cruisers, the grounds, ground surveillance, and then it's the national security apparatus or agency that does what they call deconfliction, which is they look at all of the different inputs from Air Force, Army, Navy detection systems, and they go, okay, these 3 tracks that look like 3 missiles are really just 1 missile. Shoot that, fire at that one. And so that was done, and then I don't know what they do. Roll the dice, push a button on the random number generator, and they go, okay, you knocked out 98% or 30%, depending on what the day was. And that was pretty much it. So I kind of want to save the best for last, but I know I want to wrap up here within the first hour. But yeah, that drill we would do over and over, and there was usually a kink in there every time, and people got to be pretty good at working those kinks out. I mean, it was there's been a launch, an uncoordinated or unannounced launch, and get the president on the phone and fight the war. And Link 16 is one of these things that involves satellites and perpetually orbiting command and control aircraft and radio systems that have to be working with lots of redundancy 24/7 that are in communication with NORAD and the combatant commanders. So there's this huge infrastructure to make sure that the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines are all talking to each other about the missiles. There's national security agencies, satellites that are doing the math to deconflict those traces to make sure they're not sending 3 missiles to engage one, and that goes on, and that's what it takes about 30 minutes of flight time and shoot down time, etc. To get that done. Now, I think back in April, the drones were a little slower, so that's a plus. They might be harder to hit, but it takes them longer to get to the target. That might change. Theoretically, you could have supersonic drones, but so the kind of the last note on that is there's a lot of different flavors of ground invasion. Every few decades, we invade Haiti to help them out. And that's gone on since the Marines started landing there in the 1800s. And that type of, it's a ground invasion, let's just be frank, but it's designed to provide service support to those people, right? Water purification units, communications units, medical units. They're there to provide that type of aid and service that instead of providing that to warfighters, they're providing that to hurricane recipients or people that have been devastated by a hurricane. And so the only combat assets that are sent with that start out as just enough to protect those things so they don't get looted or stolen or overrun. So it's kind of the reverse order of the way a combat operation comes out, where the 82nd Airborne jumps in with as much ammunition as they can carry and no support until it gets there about 2 or 3 days later. And then the support starts showing up. So it's a different kind of, it requires a very different kind of planning, sort of logistics forward planning to go into conceivably a country that has been, not hit by a hurricane or like Haiti, but has been hit by missiles, possibly nuclear missiles, which would require decontamination teams, etc. And I was going to mention JOPES and the tip fid and all that crazy jargonese, but just it's enough to say there's a system for developing plans of getting the right people in at the right time, and it could be 180 degrees depending on the type of situation. If you're going there to fight a war, it's kind of trigger pullers and bullets first, and if you're going there to provide humanitarian assistance, it's all those water purification, medical, etc. So that was kind of the last bit when they would give us that. Oh, you shot down 30% of their missiles. It's like, oh, then we need to use Plan B and do this, and if you shot down 98, 99, 99.9 like we did on this most recent battle in April rather, you don't have to send anybody. Maybe you send a carrier, gets there 6 months later. So all that gets a different calculus. So yeah, that's the better part of what I got to say. I'm wide open for questions, and I'll throw out a couple things, and that is one is our force development has been transitioning for since I left the force, and I try to keep up with that. There's some stuff about using robots that's interesting. There's also some stuff about how we integrate with NATO that has gone through some changes. So, and then what other questions you got?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that overview, Alan. And as Daniel Tweed writes, the U.S. Department of Defense does far more readiness training than any other military. That is mostly what makes it preeminent, and certainly still the U.S. military is by far the most powerful force in the world. So whenever it does get engaged in any sort of conflict, it has this overwhelming asymmetrical advantage that you mentioned. Now, I will have a question for you, and then we'll hear from Jose. And my question for you is there essentially a sequence of steps depending on the outcome? Like if the U.S. Central Command detects missiles coming in and they're monitoring the missiles and they see what fraction of them are getting shot down, say, by Israel, is there, first of all, a reliance on Israel's defense system, the Iron Dome, to do its work, and then perhaps if the Iron Dome is insufficiently able to shoot down all of the missiles, then the U.S. systems get engaged, and then there's a hope that an outcome would happen similar to what happened with the last Iranian missile attack, where all of the Iranian missiles get shot down, inflicting fairly little damage, and then there doesn't need to be a ground operation. There doesn't need to be a full retaliation. So perhaps if you could describe the sequence of events and whether there could be, for instance, some milder decisions made along the way if it's determined that this is not a situation that merits a full escalation.
Yes. So yeah, yes, I can answer that. And so, but no, there's not really a distinction. And so, yeah, I didn't mention Iron Dome earlier. Iron Dome is what the world, originally Israel and the U.S., called their integrated air defense system. And I didn't really elaborate on all of the intricacies of that, because it's basically integrated with our own system. So their national security apparatus is communicating in real time with our national security apparatus, and they are one of the signatories to the missile launch treaty. So they get notified if there's an unannounced launch, because everybody in the world that cares gets notified. And if there's an unannounced launch, we notify them. So it's not like Israel finds it out first. The national security and NORAD figure it out first. They're the second people to know there's a launch. Now, right after whoever pushed the button. That group is the second on the planet to know, and then Netanyahu is shorthand, I guess, for Israel. Then they're the third, right? If they're the target. Typically, they'll see the volume of the launch right there, and because there's so much integrated sharing of information, we know how many they can shoot down. We know how many we need to apply to aim for that 99.999 Iron Dome, right? That stops that. So yeah, it's not like there's at no point is there like, oh, we got this. Only fire. It's like only fire if you see one get through. It's very rapid. They say that the whole war is fought within 30 minutes. I say war. I mean, it kind of is. It kind of is a war, because now after that, then what I call all the time and space variables, like how long does it take to get the U.S. military from the United States over to Israel? Parts of them are already there. But yeah, it's not a stepwise system. It's all at once.
It's all at once. Interesting. So it really relies on the ability to essentially instantaneously assess the extent of the threat and the extent of the response. So thank you for that answer. Jose, please go ahead.
Yes, very interesting. And I have two questions. One is about using more and more technology. You mentioned about robots, about drones, of course, about missiles and earlier rockets. But now, how about artificial intelligence? With artificial intelligence, you know, a lot of the field operations can be controlled and using robots. So are you afraid of artificial intelligence? Because normally I like to say, at least in civilian terms, that I am not afraid of artificial intelligence. I am afraid of human stupidity. Human stupidity. But when we are talking about war, it is different. So what is your take on that, artificial intelligence and so much technology in war? And then I have another quick question later.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. I think you've certainly nailed it. I mean, I'm not scared of toasters, but I don't want anyone to throw one into the bathtub with me, right? I mean, so it's how people use the tools and the technology. But for example, I mean, I think like in this case where we're talking about, you know, a missile is just smarter than a rocket. It's kind of the definitional difference. Well, an AI-guided missile might be able to fly deceptively or to have, you know, additional chaff or heat grenades that go out to fool the countermeasures. So we can start making weapons that act and not only behave in ways with countermeasures to our systems, but can actually think about which ones to use, which is vitally important in a situation that's happening. I mean, basically the war is fought out. I mean, the war's already fought, and I think we kind of saw. I mean, the drill went. It happened just like we kind of like we had planned back in between 2009 and 2012 when I was there doing that. Yeah, it pretty much happened just like we fought it out over and over, and it's because it's a matter of those. You know, the algorithm is already programmed in. Right? I mean, that's what we're doing. We've already figured out. If they launch this many, we launch that many. We know what our kill rates are. We know what their performance rates are. And it's just a lot of math, kind of at that point. And AI may or may not help with that. I don't. I would want AI on my side in that situation. To help make that decision very rapidly.
Okay, and second question. You know, Israel has incredible technology, and the Iron Dome was supposed to be the best defense system in the planet. And in fact, it was successful. When the Palestinians attacked from Gaza, they didn't attack the Iron Dome. They just did it the old way. They attacked on the ground.
Right.
So all that fantastic technology wasn't helpful at the end. But my question is, how would that apply to Korea? Because South Korea is in a very similar situation. And they say they even have a better Iron Dome than Israel. So do you know about the Iron Dome in South Korea and what could happen in South Korea?
I mean, I know how the one in Israel works. And we have a very well integrated defense system with South Korea. I am not sure it's integrated at the same level, but I haven't operated in that theater. So I'm just speaking because I don't know. It's not that I never did work in that area. I'll tell you, this is just a quick experience that I had in Iraq when I was working with the State Department. We wanted to get up armored, as they would call them, up armored Suburbans for our diplomats, right? So we wanted armored Suburbans for our diplomats to drive around in. And we started from scratch. We were like, well, how much armor plating does a Suburban need? And what are they? And we learned very quickly that, hey, wait a second, the military already has classes of armor, right? Class 1 is stop small arms. Class 2 will stop small arms and rifle and machine gun fire. Class 3 will stop, a rocket-propelled grenade. Class 4 is what is kind of what a main battle tank has. And so, and in certain, there's even a class 5, but that's, ablative armor and explosive armor, that things like that. Anyway, so we said, okay, well, what do we need? Class 1, 2, or 3, or 4? And we started looking at it, and as we, the cost doesn't. It's not a gradual scale up. It's an exponential scale up when you're talking about equipping a vehicle. And so they said, well, do we want to spend the extra money? Because we might get attacked by RPGs. That's a real threat. And I don't know, I just was tired of the discussion perhaps. And I said, well, we might get attacked by Sherman Williams. You don't want to be stuck on a crowded street full of civilians, right? And they throw Sherman Williams paint on your windshield, right? You're stuck. You can't go anywhere without possibly running somebody over. I mean, that shuts you down as much as any RPG, right? But without the direct explosive loss of life. So we said, yeah, okay, level 3 is good enough, and I think there's those kind of calculations also go into what we call the low tech under, right? So as with Israel and Gaza, Gaza's not going to shoot missiles into Israel anymore because it's just not effective. But they will do other things. They will tunnel under. They will do ground attacks, paragliding. It's a new one back October of last year. So that low tech under is always going to be there. There's always some. Somebody can find the plug, they can unplug all of your systems. So I just say that to kind of get that concept of the low tech under is always a threat. And then secondly, I don't have any personal experience with the Korean model, but I think that it's probably something similar to what Israel has. It's probably got its own Korean flair, and the diplomatic interface is probably slightly different just because it's a different group of diplomats and soldiers working on it. So, and I don't know what those differences are.
Mm-hmm. Well, talking about low tech, it reminds me also of the Vietnam War. The USA and South Vietnam had all the technology, all the support, and the Viet Cong actually eventually won with low tech, with no tech.
Yeah. What is it? General Diop said, "We defeated your B-52s with a loaf of bread and a match." And so they would send one soldier out with a loaf of bread, and they would say, "Go out as far as you can until you run out of food, right? Till this loaf, as far as this loaf of bread will get you. Then set up a ring of campfires, so that it looks like there's a big encampment there, and then come back because they're going to bomb it." And so, so those airstrikes would be happening way away from whatever it was they actually wanted to do.
By the way, I love what you have in your back, on the right on your back. Also next to the Holy Bible, close to the Holy Bible, you have the death of death.
Yes, and one way to help achieve the death of death is to prevent autonomous killing systems. And given the discussion just now, I will point to Section 83 of the U.S. Transhumanist Party platform, which reads as follows: "The United States Transhumanist Party opposes any development or deployment of weapons systems that are capable of killing or injuring human beings in the absence of an explicit command by a human being to take action in every specific instance. Autonomous drones, vehicles, or other combat systems may not be permitted to make life or death decisions on the basis of a program, algorithm, predictive model, or any other means other than a specific decision by a human being who is closely familiar with the circumstances surrounding any given military situation. Accordingly, the United States Transhumanist Party supports the campaign to stop killer robots and other initiatives to abolish all autonomous weapons and preclude the development of such weapons." And one can find the campaign to stop killer robots at stopkillerrobots.org. .org. Also, it's noteworthy because Luis Arroyo asked, is Israel using AI in Gaza? And there were reports in April of this year of a system called Lavender. Here's an article describing it, which is not a fully autonomous system. It's essentially a system that suggests targets who are likely to be members of Hamas or Islamic Jihad, but it is a predictive model. So it uses essentially algorithms to estimate whether these individuals are targets, but it could be wrong as well. And the current protocol within the Israeli military is that a human still has to make decisions to essentially sign off on any strike against such targets. The criticism has been that, especially in the early months of the war in Gaza, the Israeli military relied on the Lavender recommendations pretty much uncritically. And this has led to some, let's say, false positives, some people who were killed as a result of human decisions to launch strikes, which, upon further investigation, probably should not have been killed. So, Alan, I'm wondering if you can provide any insights on what the official U.S. military policy is in regard to autonomous weapons or decision-making systems. You yourself suggested that you would be at least hesitant to delegate that sort of responsibility to AI, that there should be a human in the loop. And I would agree with that. But what is your assessment of the current approaches and also where they're likely to go in the future? Will the U.S. military also embrace the campaign to stop killer robots?
I think we still reserve the right for first use of nuclear weapons. So I don't think our government has explicitly ruled that out. So I don't think they're going to rule out autonomous weapons or removing a human from the loop. I think it's a bad idea to go with a fully autonomous system for all the reasons. My uncle worked for Martin Marietta creating missiles. He also helped design the chip that put the space shuttle into space too. So he's done some good and bad stuff there. But one of the things that he mentioned was really difficult for their sensors was to tell the difference between a fuel tanker, which could be a really valid military target, has the hot engine under the cab up front, a fairly uniform heat signature along the back where the fuel tank is, and a school bus, which has a hot engine up front and a fairly uniform heat signature along the back end. Really difficult stuff to parse out, especially back in the 80s when he was doing that. But I think we want somebody who can really get in there and look and go, school bus, could be a school bus, right? Let's err on the side of the children, right? I mean, it looks like looks like a school bus. And obviously we don't want to encourage our adversaries to paint all of their fuel tanks yellow or whatever, but I think we need a human in the loop, especially now. I mean, I would certainly, like I say, because of the nature and rapidity of missile warfare as opposed to ground warfare, I think having really smart computers involved is a real plus. But specifically to your question of what is our national policy is to keep a human in the loop. But my personal experience has been, and I don't mean to be I don't want to sound like a conspiracy nut, but basically, because even though that's our official policy, it doesn't mean we're not researching all sorts of other alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there may be research to develop these autonomous weapons systems, even if they haven't been deployed yet. And I'm glad that the official policy is to keep a human in the loop. Hopefully that will remain the official policy. But indeed, many comments in the chat have pointed out that there are temptations to go in the direction of fully autonomous fully autonomous weapons. Mike Lazine wrote, "What would happen if we Americans stop autonomous killer robots, but our enemies do this? It would be like us being in a real world Terminator universe, humans against machines." Well, but there's no guarantee that fully autonomous weapons would actually bring about a better outcome for the side using them, because there could be so many false positives. There could be so many strange and unpredictable ways that that system fails that it would actually damage the side using it. For instance, if there are a lot of targets that are destroyed that are completely innocent or extraneous, that could even provoke a stronger retaliation against the country using autonomous weapons. And there have been past instances of the entire world coming together to ban certain weapons, like chemical and biological weapons, for instance, because it was recognized that these weapons are so indiscriminate that the damage cannot be confined to one's enemies. And it became a fairly easy case to make to persuade all of the major powers in the world to just promise never to use those weapons. But Daniel, you have a question, so please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the great insight into current rules of engagement, warfighting doctrine. I guess the first question is, do you feel like you may have gone awry from any non-disclosure contracts that you might have been bound by during your...
No, I made a pretty diligent effort to base what I said on most of that Wikipedia data that's out there, but also I think it's, there is, like you say, non-disclosure, but there's, I was Lieutenant Colonel when I ended my career, and I was when I was doing these drills, I didn't need to know how the satellites talk to each other, but I guarantee there's an E5 technician out there who absolutely needs to know how that works, and I'm glad of it, right? So I mean, I think, yeah, there's no, I think I kept it on above board and open sources.
I had a follow-up other question. It's like, it seems like in the 60s during the mutually assured destruction kind of era, there was a lot of emphasis on civil defense and fallout shelters and preparation for surviving a nuclear disaster. It seems to me that that was actively kind of abandoned at some point. Do you think we'll ever return to kind of like look at Israel? They have a very immensely prepared population. They have panic rooms that are actually hermetically sealed against chemical attacks and such. And I think they have very well-armed civilian populace, which you could probably make the same comment about a pretty well-armed U.S. population too. I think the Japanese even said, "Oh, it's going to be awful if we have to invade the United States because they got so many guns." But did you get a sense that that civil defense kind of policy has or is or will be changing in the foreseeable future?
So let me give you some kind of anecdotes that may seem random at first, but I'll try to pull them together at the end. So, even Rick in Casablanca tells the Nazis, there's some parts of New York I would advise you to stay out of, right? And I would suggest that while we have largely defunded our civil defense program, those funds were probably diverted before they were canceled. And I would just use the Hurricane Katrina 9th Ward levees as an example. I don't know where those monies went, but they didn't go into improving the levees, which is certainly a civil defense use there. And so I think a lot of that comes from passivity, this idea that, if we get nuked, it's all over anyway. Might be some defeatism there, but let's work on not having a nuclear exchange instead of preparing for surviving one. And when I started working in the JOC in 2009, that December, Israel invaded Gaza on that occasion too, in what was called Operation Cast Lead. And I heard about it on CNN because we watched CNN the full time. But I also was hearing the military intelligence aspects reports. And so I came to sort of a different conclusion, and just sort of, well, okay, and I'll come back to what that was in a moment. But you probably heard how Hamas in Gaza, they're using these hospital basements for their command and control centers, and they're hiding behind human shields. Well, all right, so one, that's true. They did that. But how did Israel know? It's because Israel built those hospitals. They provide all the plumbing and all the electricity in the hospitals too in Gaza. And they built those underground civil defense shelters when they built them. And so they knew those shelters existed, and they knew that Hamas was using them as command and control bunkers. So it's a little bit, yeah. Well, so in that regard, I mean, I think yes, their country, they are probably I doubt there's somebody, playing the role of Soviet general and like skimming off the civil defense money, right? There's no city council saying, we got our federal matching grant for civil defense. I think we ought to build a park so our kids are happy about, and take their mind off doing duck and cover drills. And I don't think that's going on in Israel. I think they're actually, like you say, stockpiling goods. They've got HEPA filters on their buildings to keep, poisonous air out, either chemical or biological weapons out. So, yeah, that leads me to another topic, but I think that answers. I hope that answers that question. I think they're very strong on their civil defense. They even built those civil defense systems into Gaza, and I think we got complacent. I mean, I don't know that that's something that we. It's better not to have a civil war. Better to spend your resources creating the illusion of the Star Wars, platinum dome, and bankrupting your adversary. It's better to do that than to, try to survive the war, right? You don't want to go in toe-to-toe nuclear combat, as they say in Doctor Strange.
Yes, indeed. And I do think all efforts should be focused on preventing a nuclear exchange, because even if humankind survives a nuclear exchange, the consequences will be dire and they could set back our civilization for centuries. So yes, perhaps there might be a dark age and then a period of rebuilding and all will not be lost. But for us, the prospect of indefinite life extension would be lost because our civilization would just not have the technological infrastructure to achieve that anymore. Now, speaking of preventing a nuclear exchange, one man who is a hero in this regard is Stanislav Petrov. In 1983, he was a Soviet officer essentially in charge of transmitting information about a nuclear launch to the higher ups, and essentially he was notified by a number of systems that the US had launched multiple nuclear missiles. And he made the decision there that this is probably a false alarm, that he shouldn't report it. If he had reported it, essentially it would have been a certainty that the Soviet high command would have launched a retaliatory strike and there would have been a nuclear war over a false alarm. So I wonder, in the structure that you described within the U.S. Central Command or individual officers who are monitoring signs of a possible missile exchange, is there the opportunity to make that judgment call that something is a false alarm, that something doesn't look right, even if it's just an intuition that real missile launches do not work this way?
There is, and that goes back to the national security agencies, technical expertise and specialization in all kinds of communication and signal and technological intelligence. And like I said, they deconflict those multiple streaks of missile trails so that they recognize, they sift that out. So they go, okay, that's really one missile. That one over there looks like three. That's two missiles. Additionally, our sensors can determine the difference between a nuclear missile and other missiles. Right? Nuclear missiles obviously have nuclear material, and there are ways to spoof that, but it's still difficult. I mean, you can put nuclear trash on a regular missile, make it a dirty bomb, but it still does not have the same fissile signature. So not only are there people in the loop looking at those things, but the machinery and the sensor packages and the presently it's not artificially intelligent, but it is a decision tree looking at various data and sifting it into a format. Very sophisticated, also with a human in the loop, but it's there to make sure. Iran can launch 26 missiles at once. They can probably can't launch 26 nukes at once. Yeah, and they can launch successive launches from all of their 26 launch platforms. So the idea is you're going to send one nuke and 25 missiles, maybe every time, every 5 minutes, so that some nuke gets through, right? Yeah, but having a human in the loop, having really good technical expertise is it's the overmatch we want. That's the asymmetry we want.
Yes, absolutely. Good humans in the loop add to the asymmetry that the U.S. would have as an advantage in these conflicts. And sometimes the outcome that we want, the best outcome that we want, is to recognize if there is no conflict. And then the second best outcome is to prevent damage from a conflict that arises. And along these lines, one of the resources you link to is the Wikipedia entry for the Strategic Defense Initiative. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration tried to create a nuclear missile shield around the United States and allied countries. Unfortunately, the technology was not quite ready at the time to effectively intercept nuclear weapons. And now there is again discussion of it. I actually heard a speech by Donald Trump proposing to reinstate a similar initiative, though this surprised me. I actually see this as quite a favorable development. Israel, of course, has its Iron Dome, and Trump was comparing this to essentially an Iron Dome for the United States, except with nuclear missile interception capabilities. This would, if it's completely successful, greatly diminish the threat of a nuclear attack against the United States. But what do you think about the feasibility of this, given your experience, as well as how that would change the current response protocols if the US had something like an Iron Dome, except much more capable?
Yeah, I think it's important that we do some reasoning from analogy, not only, but I think that's our ability to excel over AI. And just adding up the numbers, some kind of I think Trump called it a platinum dome, but I would suggest that even in the 80s, the idea was to fund a lot of science. And make the Soviets really worry, make them spend a lot of money they didn't have, and ultimately to collapse them economically. So in that regard, it was a very slick kind of a strategic move. I remember my own position changing on that, thinking, this is stupid, right? Like we don't have the capability. And, as I was promoted up through the ranks, I got commissioned and got various other briefings, and Reagan even signed my commission order. I started to learn, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we're able to come up with this system, as long as the Soviets start, try to keep up with us in the spending, kind of like the mine shaft gap in Dr. Strangelove. But I've lost the thread on your question. But anyway, I do think that was so let me go. That's the adding up piece that I think a computer can do faster than us, and say, yes, that's a good thing that we can probably do a better job of now. But I would like to use the analogy of the Warring States period in Italy. Leonardo da Vinci was on the downturn of his career. At one point, he was older and less productive, and left the Medicis, and he went to work for another Italian family, city-state, and they said, "Hey, we want you to figure out. We want to crush Genoa, and we want you to figure out how to block the river so that they don't get water." Right? They were basically clashing over the water rights, and Leonardo worked on it and worked on it and worked on it, and then he came and said, "Look, what are you getting done?" He said, "Well, here it is." And he rolls out the plan, and it was a way that both city-states could get enough water that they wouldn't need to compete. Okay, they would both have all the food they needed and the resources they needed, and not need to be military competitors. At which point they said, "You apparently didn't understand the assignment. We wanted to figure out a way to crush our adversaries." So I think to the extent that we can come up with a solution that keeps everybody safe, and I think if we were able to integrate this to some degree with planetary defense, I mean, we did. The idea of shooting down a missile a bullet with another bullet is pretty wild. But we've demonstrated we can do that with missiles, and we've demonstrated that we can hit an asteroid that's orbiting another asteroid with the DART program, the redirect program. So if we can do that for ourselves, we could probably make sure nobody can successfully fire off a nuclear weapon. And that type of a solution would go a lot farther to having us all live long and prosper, rather than just a system that protects the U.S.
I like that idea, essentially a planetary missile defense system that would shoot down any nuclear missile and would neutralize the threat of a nuclear war altogether. Most likely, if that kind of system were developed and proved to be effective, then multilateral nuclear disarmament would follow. Essentially, the technology of nuclear missiles would be made obsolete because the shield would just shoot them all down. So thank you very much for that response. And it is an intriguing idea that we will explore further in terms of promoting a way that could actually viably achieve multilateral nuclear disarmament. So now let us go to Art Ramon and see if he has a question.
I don't think I've ever talked about this before, but back in 2005-ish, during the Second Gulf War, I was in communication with a friend of mine who was deployed out there. And, I was also a big fan of Stargate. And somehow these ideas, these conspiracy theories formed in my head. I was like, they're recovering a Stargate out there in some city. And he said, "How do you know?" I was like, I don't know, it just popped in my head one day. And, after that, he told me that one of his commanders was trying to recruit him as a Freemason. I don't know, maybe to keep him quiet or something other. And kind of lost contact with him. But 4 years ago, the same conspiracy theory, I saw it on Ancient Aliens. So And they were saying it was Nebuchadnezzar's Stargate, and that supposedly the Iraq invasion was a pretense for going in there and doing this recovery of a Stargate that Saddam Hussein was trying to get operational. But do you know of anything like the U.S. engaging in antiquities recovery, in foreign nations? Have you heard of anything like that?
Yes. Yeah, I'm really disappointed you didn't get the movie rights, because you could be bankrolling our candidates with that. That's an awesome story. I think I included. I think there's a link in there just about the Iraq invasion and it for in the arena that I was working, which was basically political interface, that realm. The term, like, for example, the term weapon of mass destruction has a pretty clear-cut definition in the UN, which is where Colin Powell gave his famous presentation where he said they have weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction by the UN definition are any nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, and nuclear includes high yield explosives that scatter nuclear material, right? Not requiring any fission, what's called a dirty bomb, right? So the irony, I think, I often hear people go, oh, well, how come they didn't have any, they didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. They didn't have any nukes, and to a large degree, I go back to when I was in basic training, when I enlisted. The Israelis set their nuclear systems back at least 20 years. So, but the reason that we knew they had weapons of mass destruction, in this case chemical weapons, which were very sophisticated, what's called a binary chemical weapon, the spin that the artillery piece imparts on the projectile causes the two vials inside to break and mix together, so that when they explode, it's chemical. So it's very safe to operate with. And once you fire it, it's a chemical weapon. But we knew they had them because we sold them those chemical weapons. So the U.S. government authorized the sale of munitions that were made by U.S. companies, because we don't farm that process outside the country. We use a large corporate contractor. So anyway, I say all that just because other things that came across my desk when I was working for the State Department, because the State Department would ask their people, "You want to go to Iraq?" And they would say no. And so they would say, "Hey, Army, how about we give you the money and you send one of your people, right? So we'll try and make this interdepartmental transfer," which they literally call a dipper. So which is, so they paid me, my salary to go and work for the State Department. But yeah, we confiscated yellow cake, and there was literally a multi-week operation. That was just the operation to recover the yellow cake, right? So, which is a precursor for making nuclear weapons, not actual yellow cake. But the intelligence systems had been in place for several months prior to that. So yeah, that was in 2004 that we literally were chasing people across the country to get this rogue vehicles full of precursor elements for making nuclear weapons. Now, did I hear anything about a Stargate? No, but when we invaded Iraq, those chemical weapons were buried in the desert by Saddam forces, loyalist forces. And we literally did have to excavate them from the ground. And I'm sure that was conducted with a very large security blanket and a top secret classification of where we were digging up those weapons. We didn't want other I love how the military uses competitors, right? So asymmetric or otherwise, competitors to come try to get them, right? They could show up as laborers and then try to sneak them out or whatever. So it wouldn't surprise me a bit that anybody looking from the outside at what they were doing when they were digging up those classified things, really just artillery rounds. Yeah, could have easily been it could have easily been a Stargate. So that's what I'm getting there, and I'm still disappointed you didn't get the movie rights. But yeah, that's what I don't know. That's what I got.
All right, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alan. And speaking of, let's say, artifacts that may or may not be present, Sergio Terrera wonders if you have any thoughts about UAP disclosure. He writes, there is a major concerted human and even congressional effort to come clean with us and admit the existence of these impressive crafts and beings. A new book by Elizondo, Lou Elizondo, is coming out in 2 days, which is supposed to have new revelations, and an important documentary by James Fox should be out soon too. Now, I have long been agnostic on the subject of UAPs in the sense that I want the information to be disclosed. I think the classification of such information often creates a lot of speculation that may or may not be valid, and it's better to just put all of this information out into the open and let people know what, if anything, the U.S. military has known about these aircraft, if they exist, for the past 70 years or so. But what is your outlook on this? Do you believe that there is anything to be disclosed, anything that is not mundane based on your experience? And if so, what would be the nature of it? Because there could be many answers other than these are alien craft. This could be an advanced military technology that was developed by humans, for instance, that the US military has chosen to keep secret because of concerns that other governments might reverse engineer it in some way.
So yes, yeah, and I should probably formally disclose that this I am speaking on my own behalf about my own experience and not on behalf of the U.S. government. But the stealth fighter is a classic example of, we were flying that thing out of Area 51 for years before we ever used it in real life, whatever, in a combat situation and it's not invisible as has been reported, but it is invisible to radar, and it does have some very, I was about to say very unique. It has unique characteristics that make it look strange and not like a regular airplane. So I'm sure there were reports of that as a UAP. I guess that's the thing we're calling them now. Likewise, lights that shoot straight up into the sky. I saw somebody debunk this myth, and it was very clear. They showed an aircraft going down the runway from the side at night. You could see the airplane's running lights as it traveled from left to right, and then it went up, 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 up. Well, then they drove around to the other side of the base, and so that they were at the end of the runway. And so they waited for the next aircraft to take off, and when it did, what you see is a light that comes at you very brightly and then goes straight up because it's not moving left or right, it's just moving up. So the really interesting optical kind of illusion there. Now, those two very plain disclosures aside, I'll tell you two experiences that I had in the military. That one, when I was in the JOC at UCOM, the little theater seating area, it had a hallway around it with secured doors, and we had to lock up our phones outside. And near where we locked up our phones, there was another office, and it was a little office, and it was top secret, compartmentalized, what they call SCI's, secure compartmentalized information. And it was occupied only by 2 Air Force officers. And we got to shooting the breeze in the hallway, and I said, "Oh, what is it you guys do in that little room back there?" And I was just kind of joking around. And they go, oh, it's no big deal. He says, we maintain, knowledge, the status on all of the gravity bombs in our arsenal. Man, I've been reading too much sci-fi. I was like, what? We have gravity bombs? And of course, they started laughing, because what they're really talking about is these, a dumb nuclear bomb that they drop. It's gravity propelled down to the surface, and then that we supply to NATO. So we, those two guys tracked all of the NATO gravity bombs, But so I thought, oh man, we are way beyond where I thought we were at. But prior to that, a couple of years prior to that, when I was at U.S. Central Command, 05 to 08, because it's a joint command, my last 10 years in the service were all in joint command positions with combatant commands. I had an opportunity to work with several Air Force officers that I spoke with separately and gave me very similar stories. And they had worked at different air bases. One of them had worked at Area 51. The others had worked at Wright-Patterson, I think, is the one that does all where you'd think they would have all the intelligence about the UAP program. And the consensus, or the common thread among all their stories, was that because of the classified nature of these UAP investigations, Operation Blue Book, that kind of thing. I mean, they obviously wanted to find out what is that thing flying over. It's unidentified. Doesn't mean it's from another planet. It might be an enemy aircraft. It might be a Chinese spy balloon, right? We want to identify it. That's the key, which was what prompted all those investigations. But to the extent that there were actual technological specifications of things that they had encountered, and again, this was in the early 2000s, long enough for the institutional kind of memory of the organization to have gone on, almost long enough. A lot of those programs were not just filed on a shelf like Operation Blue Book. They were literally transferred to the private sector, meaning our own, military industrial complex. So Lockheed, Martin, Marietta, Vaught, those General Dynamics, those companies were given privileged secrets, right, for their own use, and then those secrets were expunged from the records. And the reason that this was done is because technically a FOIA request for that information, Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, would require disclosure. And it was, classification systems usually go for, there's kind of as needed for things that only, like for an operation, they're only classified while that operation's going on. Once it's through being conducted, there's no point in keeping it secret. It's already out. People know, right? So those type of things. Then there's also 25 years, 50 years, which is why they released a lot of information about the JFK stuff after 50 years. It was just a standard classification, wore off of that, and they were able to release that stuff. So to avoid that problem with these UAP, or whatever they got in Hangar 18 and the things they had learned about it, to avoid that, really, sort of mixed feelings on this, because they wanted the government to be transparent. Right? We want people to be able to do a FOIA request and find out, right? Or to find out what's going on in their government. So if we have things that we really want to keep secret, we don't want that within the governmental structure. And consequently, those were literally contracted off to our military defense. That's what I got from 4 different Air Force officers while I was at U.S. Central Command. I don't know. Maybe they all got in the back room one day and they said, we're going to have 4 separate conversations with Crowley and, get these Army guys all spun up. I don't know, but it's very plausible. Seemed plausible to me.
Very interesting, and thank you for these insights, Alan. Sergio Terrero writes, those private companies that you mentioned managed to cripple the last bill to disclose as Schumer and company, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, tried to enforce eminent domain and recover all these crafts from these contractors. What is startling to me is Chuck Schumer is a powerful man. He is the Senate Majority Leader. He is one of the most influential politicians in the country. And he is a supporter of UAP disclosure. And there are others in Congress as well who are supporters. And yet even they cannot get this information, in part because of what you mentioned, that these technologies were transferred to private contractors. And yes, I think one needs to consider essentially what are the interests that are so invested in this secrecy and why, and furthermore, why they're willing to deal with this public outcry or tolerate it rather than essentially satisfy the calls of those who are seeking disclosure, especially since if there's really nothing to it, disclosure would provide the evidence that there's really nothing to it. So there's a lot to think about there, but I appreciate the discussion. Now, I also wanted to see if Jason has a question.
Yeah, I'm curious. We kind of mentioned earlier about like that one Russian guy that sort of saved the world or whatever. And it seems like we have this perception that the whole world is always on this like knife's edge where, one wrong move and it's nuclear Armageddon, you know what I mean? I'm curious what you think. How close are we really? I mean, we got that whole nuclear clock, which I think is kind of deceptive, really. I mean, because it gives the assumption that it's ticking down and, can't pick it back up. I mean, it just don't seem, I wouldn't use a clock as a measurement because, and it's like, we had the 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know what I mean? But yet also we had, Korea, and we had Vietnam, we didn't go to nuclear war during all that stuff. So I'm, and American and Russian planes are, coming in, near each other all the time. You know what I mean? So I'm just wondering what you think, how close are we really? Because it seems like we are, but then it seems like, well, maybe we're not, because I mean, we have this long history of not going to nuclear war. Plus the Ukraine thing, how many red lines did we think, oh, better not do this, it's going to be nuclear war. And each time, time after time, there's been probably 10 of them, and each time it didn't happen. So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to Daniel Tweet first. Ever since I saw Dr. Strangelove, I have never said nuclear war the same. So, all right, but yeah, to answer your question, Jason, which a very good question, I appreciate that. This idea, and I agree with you on the clock metaphor, because it's not always ticking forward. It's more like a needle, right? It's a barometer of sorts. When I was at the UCOM JOC there, U.S. European Command Joint Operations Center, one of the last projects that I worked on, we were just getting started with it. As a staff officer, I found it fascinating. And as a taxpayer, I found it refreshing. Although I had no problems leaving and retiring. I was like glad to give it up. But you probably heard of the DEFCON 1 and DEFCON 2 and DEFCON 3. We were literally taking those big 3-ring binders off the shelf and rewriting them into a more appropriate type of defense posture planning. So, for example, this idea that, oh, they're thinking about nuclear weapons, we're going to ramp up all of our industrial base, all of our military base, our missiles are going to be, sitting, with the engines running on the pad just in case, we reach this defense condition. And that's not really reflective of what goes on in the world now. So conceivably, we could be fighting a war in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in North Africa and still be intercepting, shipping along the Indian Ocean for weapon smuggling and drug smuggling, and also, intercepting oil and other, national assets that are being pirated in the Java Sea or whatever, right along the Malacca Straits or whatever. So at the same time that we are, like in Iraq, we were literally fighting on one block, doling out food and Band-Aids on one block and, defending in the block in between. And so the three, we call it the 3-block war. That was the reality of the situation, and it didn't mean that we had every citizen in the United States on a wartime footing. We weren't. So anyway, those old defense plans were really out of date. They were designed for a Cold War period, which really ended in the late 80s, and here it was, 2010, and we were just getting around to revising the manual, which I thought was really interesting stuff to see how those different aspects integrated and all that. So I think there has been a real politic, so to say, like kind of, because around the 2000s, they came out with what they call the whole of government approach to war fighting. So it wasn't just the Joint Chiefs, but also our diplomatic corps, our industrial base, and other things like that. So I like to think that they went ahead and finished that project, and that we have a much better, hopefully by now, it's been 10 years, a much better kind of internal documentation on how do we escalate in various parts of the world without triggering a giant global event, right? So, I hope that answers your question, but I was looking at this on the map, just in between when Gennady invited me to do this and today, and I was like, wow, the Ukraine and Israel are a lot closer. It's like New York to Texas. It's just not that far. It's just, I don't know. Anyway, but we're still able to sort of keep those situations separate.
Well, it's interesting because everything in that part of the world is much closer than perhaps many Americans might think at first glance. Keep in mind that what is today Crimea and what is today Israel were both parts of the Roman Empire at one point. So a single power in the ancient world controlled both of them. But to the point regarding the so-called doomsday clock, John H. writes, it goes both ways, usually toward midnight, though, and indeed, since January of 2023, the doomsday clock has been at 90 seconds to midnight. During much of the Cold War, it has been several minutes to midnight, and the methodology changed recently as well to include, say, climate risks, which I think kind of shifts that particular metric to something else. It used to just essentially measure the risk of human annihilation through nuclear war, but climate change by itself could make life very difficult for humans. It cannot cause the extinction of our species. And the Wikipedia entry that I had showed also identifies various criticisms of the doomsday clock from Anders Sandberg as well as Steven Pinker. So those are worthwhile to look into. Now, I realize that we have about 5 minutes left in our salon, and I wanted to ask you one question, Alan, before we get to a closing statement from you. And that is in regard to the influence on policy that someone in a position similar to the one you used to have could exert. You mentioned that you did substantively actually revise policy, even though that wasn't really your role. But the fact is that a lot of the civilian decision makers just don't have the deep expertise in these kinds of matters that you do. And even if they are the people who ultimately decide, for instance, to enact a law or to change a particular high-level policy, they would have to make those decisions based on the recommendations of specialists. So I'm curious, what room is there for people in the military to substantively affect policy if, for instance, based on their knowledge of the facts on the ground, so to speak, or the technologies involved, they think the civilian decision makers just have it all wrong? It's not that they even have a different set of values. It's that they think the civilians so fundamentally misunderstand the situation and what could or could not happen that they need some corrective, essentially, some set of insights to accurately guide policy. So what extent of ability to influence the system is there from the specialists?
That is a fantastic question, and a quick anecdote. My first kind of assignment when I got to Central Command was to lead a group, a joint group, about some decision making about a contribution from a particular foreign nation that we wanted their help in the coalition. And we spent less than 5 minutes, basically, well, I don't know, here's what the Navy, here's what the Navy says, and I don't know what you guys do, but we, and then it's sort of this, combative, within our own, we're the Navy, we're the Air Force, we fly above all that, that's your, and I said, look, all right, and I came up with this, which is kind of interesting. It came back to me later. I call it the 2/3 ignorance rule, right? Because you get your Army, Navy, and Air Force, and in any group, 2 of the people don't know what your organization does. They're completely ignorant of it. And so I said, look, what you guys need to do, and I'll do the same. Go, we're going to call the meeting short early. We're going to meet again tomorrow. Come and brief us on what capabilities you bring to the table. And so that way we're not completely ignorant about what the other 2 forces have. And I don't know why. I mean, it seemed incredibly refreshing to those folks. But anyway, we did that, and we came to a pretty a favorable resolution. So I would suggest that the military is not the only realm where this occurs. Also, I think the world, to some extent, and our own nation to some extent, and our governmental leadership to a large extent, were very much in line with what they wanted the military to do. And we were saying, in order to accomplish what you want us to do, this needs to happen. So I think it was a little less adversarial in that regard. But I would suggest that the military is not the only organization like this. Silicon Valley is another one, right? What do our legislators know about tech? They don't even. I remember seeing Zuckerberg was incredibly frustrated. He says, "This is all an opt-in system, Senator." It's like you have to sign up to be in Facebook. It's an opt-in system, but yeah, now AI is a whole nother kind of a different level of the can or whatever, new can, I don't know, of worms. It's big. and I think we really don't have a judiciary that knows, software law. I mean, that's a very highly specified thing. Maritime law is a little bit better understood by senior folks, although our current crop of justices, maybe not so much. But in the past, we had, people that came out of the Navy who understood maritime, situations, who became justices. And certainly when military conscription was required of all males, our senators and congressmen had at least some idea of more about the military. So I think those things are.
So these are
have ignorant politicians,
yes.
Okay, because what they understand is politics, right?
Right.
And not, I'm not saying that to sort of fault, just in general fault them, but because they do understand. Hopefully, they at least understand politics.
Right. And I think this is a wider problem that we will need to explore in subsequent salons. Unfortunately, our time is up, but we really appreciate your insights and your expertise in this area. I think we have been thoroughly enlightened, and hopefully we can use this knowledge to help us live long and prosper.
Right on.
Live long and prosper.